This is an introduction to types in PHP. Nowadays in programming languages we generally talk about two types of language, statically typed languages and dynamically typed languages, and what this refers to is how a language handles the type of data that it is manipulating. And in PHP we have a loosely or dynamically typed language, so we don't really care about the type too much, whereas in a statically typed language like Java, types are very strict and important, and we need to tell the program what type of data we expect to be working with all the time. We need to be very explicit about it, but in PHP the rules are looser, and we can be implicit about it, and we leave that up to PHP to try and figure out what the type is. So let's just have a quick example of what that means. So suppose we have a type here in PHP, and we can just declare that type, or sorry, we have a variable here in PHP, and we can just declare the variable, we can assign it a value, and that value can be any type. It can be here, it could be an integer, it could be a boolean, it could be a double, it could be a string, it could be an array, an object, etc. And that can change during the program, so we can reassign the variable to something else. So this time we're assigning to a string. We're assigning a string to the variable. Oops. So there you can see that this variable, one name, can have multiple values. Not only can we change the value of a variable, we can also change the type of that value. So why is that unusual? Well, in a language like Java, you'd have to say, when you're creating that variable at the start, you have to say it's a string. You put in the special keyword string before the variable, and then you create a string. And if you try and assign a number such as an integer to that variable, this here would throw an error in Java. It would fail, your program would collapse. But in PHP it allows us we don't need to explain what the type of each variable is. We just create a variable, and when we assign something to it, a value to the variable, we expect that that's the type that's in there, but it could change. So why is this important? How does this matter when you create a program? PHP doesn't care about what type is in your variable until the type of the data that's in the variable until runtime, until the program runs. So now if we want to say something like if foo is greater than 4, now what does this make any sense? Let's just run it and see what happens. And it hasn't, foo is not greater than 4, nothing has been echoed here. We're just running this in the Skype editor, and just you can run this from your localhost web server. So nothing has been exit there. Let's just try if it's foo is less than 4, and remember foo is a string now, and see what happens. And there, foo is greater than 4. Just change that to less than. So foo is less than 4. So that's quite meaningless, because what does it mean that hello is less than 4? We can see we're getting a string, we're comparing it to an integer, and that's being evaluated to boolean. So you can see that this expression is being evaluated. It doesn't make sense to compare these two types of data really, but PHP does try to do it. It doesn't throw an error, it just converts those types implicitly. So it does expect certain types for certain operations, and it makes a best guess at what a type is. So suppose we have, this is always, when we use an if statement, this is always going to try and evaluate here too. It's going to expect a boolean value in here, an expression that returns boolean value. So suppose we have a string here called foo, and let's just put an else in here. So foo is going to be either true or false. Let's just set up this test here, and now let's just see what that does now. If foo, and we'll run our program, and this will show us what something about type conversion or type juggling in PHP. So see if you know what's going to happen here. If you can guess, we have a variable foo, we've assigned a string, an empty string, something in that string. Now we're saying if that string, we're doing a boolean test on that foo variable, and then we're going to say foo is true if that's true and false if it's incorrect. So let's just have a quick look, press F5 and run this now, true skies. Foo is false, so that's evaluating to false. So when you take an empty string and PHP tries to convert a string to a boolean, if it's empty it's going to be false. And similarly, if we put 0 in there, we get the same result, foo is false again. If we put 1 in here, we get true, foo is true. So, but you can see that these are some of the conversion rules that PHP uses when it converts strings to booleans. Similarly, if we put the string true in there, that's gonna, foo is true. What if we put false in here? Let's see what that does. And that's still true, so maybe that's a bit counterintuitive. Maybe we weren't expecting that. And the reason that that happens is because these are the only values that I'm not sure what, let's check that. That's true as well, yeah. That's going to evaluate to false, and that's going to evaluate to false. Maybe this as well. Let's try this, a floating point number. Now that's true also. So these two things here are going to evaluate to false, an empty string or a string with 0 in it. And similarly, if foo is an integer, 0 will evaluate to false. And let's try this one. This should probably evaluate to false as well, a floating number, 0.0, a float, and that is false. Similarly, if we don't initialize foo, if we just leave it empty, it's going to have the null value, which should evaluate to false. It does. And one of the things we can do, so PHP makes a guess of the type of variable, the type of data that's in a variable, and it does a conversion, and it uses particular rules to do that. And those rules aren't apparent to us all the time, but what we can do instead is we can make that more explicit. So suppose we want to test if foo is equal to 0. Now this one is more strict. Foo is still true because we haven't used the strict equalities operator here. Let's try this one, and now it's false. So, but what we can do instead is that's what PHP does. It uses rules to convert between types, but what happens is often quite uncertain. So what we can do to make that more explicit is we can check for types ourselves. So what we can do, we can say is, so now what we're doing here is there's a sequence of utility functions provided by PHP, which are, we have this is underscore prefixing the type of the variable. So we have is int, is bool, is float, is array, is string, and we can use those to test whether a variable contains data of a particular type. So here what we're testing is if the foo variable is an integer. So let's just test that, and it is true, of course. Now let's make this a float, and that should be false. It is false, but we could make it a float here, and it turns true. So we can see that this is a very useful function for determining the type of a variable at runtime if we need to do that. The other thing we can do is force a type conversion. So what we can do is we can use var dump. Let's just use var dump to output the type of a variable, so we can do some debugging. Var dump is just a function that takes a variable or an expression and outputs some information about it. So let's just run it there and see what it tells us about foo now at the moment. And you can see that var dump has told us that foo is a float with value 0. We could change that there. We'll just run it again and see our float has a value of 0.1. Similarly, if we get rid of that decimal point there, that's now an integer. And you can see that var dump has returned int 0, or if this was a string, you can see that that's a string with a 9 of length 9. So now suppose we have a variable in our program and we don't know exactly what that variable is at a certain point in the program, and we want to check what it is. No, we don't want to check what it is. We can use is string, is int, etc. to check, but suppose we want to make sure that it is a particular type. Suppose we have a number here, 67, and suppose we have an operation down here, if age is less than 67. If foo is less than 67, suppose it was to do with somebody's age, it needs to be less than 67 or above 67 or whatever. We need to make sure that we're using a number in that operation, and int. We can't use a string because it might do something funny when we're using that less than or greater than operator. We really need to want a number there to know what it's doing. So we need to make sure that this is, suppose this was a string. What we can do is we can force foo to become a string by using a cast, and a cast is just brackets, parentheses, with the name of the data type that you wish to cast to, followed by the name of the variable. So what this does is it does an explicit type conversion on the variable to a string. So we already have that as a string to an integer. So let's just run that, and we're getting int 67, and if we take that cast out and we run it again, we'll see that it's a string. And similarly we could put in a cast to a float, etc. and that will change it to a float. Now that's an explicit way to change the type of a variable, but there also are implicit ways. This cast is good because we can tell exactly what this is doing here, and it's quite explicit, it's quite upfront, but we can also, there's also a lot of ways to change the type of a variable that are more implicit depending on what a variable does. So we can see this one here, for instance. Let's see what this does. What type would you expect this to be? Have a think about it. And it's an integer. And why is that? This is a string. It's been added with the this operator here, the plus operator, to 0. Now it doesn't make sense to add a string and 0, so PHP converts the string to an integer. Rather, it converts the result to an integer. So it adds zeros to 67, and indeed we could add, let's just add 1 to 67 and just see the results of this. And it's an integer, result in an integer 68. So you can see that that's performed that operation. And similarly, if we have a number, say we have a number, say foo is 67, I suppose we want that as a string, we could just use the string concatenation operator and add an empty string onto that integer, and it'll convert it hopefully to a string. Let's just see if that works. Indeed it does, so now we have a string here instead, 67. So if you want to convert an integer to a string, you can add an empty string. Of course, an equivalent way of writing this is string. So why is this important? Well, one reason this may become important in your program is, suppose you were getting some information from a form about, you're getting a number, say a number of days elapsed or something, days overdue. Suppose that was a number, and it can be either 0 if a person has never been overdue a single day, or if they're overdue several days, it could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or whatever. So, and suppose we were testing for that from a HTML form, and remember when we do a GET request or a POST request in a PHP page, it always brings through the information as strings by default, of type string. So if you enter information in a form, in a web page, and that gets processed by PHP, it all gets dumped into the processing page as strings by default. And that is why type conversion is very important in PHP. You want to make sure your working with the right type of data. If you're going to use that days overdue, you want to be careful. That will evaluate defaults automatically if you added it to an if statement, for instance. So you may need to convert that to an integer before you start working with it, or check at least what it is and that it's not an empty string and so on. So that's a short introduction to the very basics of types in PHP.